advancing research methods and scholarship for gun injury prevention, and Michael Anestis, the Executive Director of the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center at Rutgers University. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly touch upon our format. Following the introduction of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Raissian will lead a moderated discussion about the policies and priorities for gun violence prevention in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Dr. Anestis will then provide some final concluding remarks at the end of our session. We have received some advanced questions from our audience, but you can also use the Q&A feature here in Zoom to pose questions to the panelists, and we will incorporate as many as possible in the time allotted. Now to introduce our guests. Assemblymember Joanne Simon joins us today from the New York State Assembly. She has dedicated her life to fighting for equal rights as a disability civil rights lawyer, educator, community activist, and progressive New York State Assembly member. She won a landmark case that went up to the Supreme Court and changed the landscape for disability rights nationwide. Assemblymember Simon was elected to the New York State Assembly representing District 52 in 2015 and currently serves as the chair of the Committee on Ethics and Guidance and the Commission on Legislative Ethics. She is a fierce advocate who has pushed for affordable housing and environmental protections and has passed major legislation on campaign finance reform, gender equity, gun violence prevention, and education. Assemblymember Simon is a leader in gun violence prevention and established New York's first firearms violence prevention research institute. She also passed New York's red flag law, the Extreme Risk Protection Order Bill, which restricts access to firearms for those who pose a serious risk of harm to themselves or others. Welcome, Assemblymember Simon. Senator Troy Singleton joins us from the New Jersey State Senate. He has devoted his life to public service in all levels of government, political, and policy posts. In 2011, he was elected to his first term in the New Jersey General Assembly, representing the over 220,000 residents of the 7th Legislative District. Senator Singleton was elected to the New Jersey State Senate in November 2017 and currently serves as chairman of the Senate Community and Urban Affairs Committee and is the Senate Majority Whip. During his time in the legislature, Senator Singleton has had a significant number of proposals signed into law and has received numerous awards for his public service and legislative acumen from business, education, civic, labor, and nonprofit organizations. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Senator Singleton. And finally, Representative Steve Staffstrom joins us today from the Connecticut House of Representatives, where he represents the Bridgeport neighborhoods of Black Rock, Brooklawn, and the West End. First elected to the General Assembly in 2015 during a special election, Representative Staffstrom serves as the House Chairman on the Judiciary Committee and sits on the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. As chairman of the Judiciary Committee, he has focused on strengthening Connecticut's gun regulations, protecting minority communities, increasing fairness and transparency in the justice system, and making statutes and courts more business-friendly. Representative Staffstrom has led the passage on banning ghost guns, requiring safe storage on all firearms in a home with children under 18, and requiring that guns be securely locked in cars to reduce the number of stolen guns in our streets. He has also led the passage of modernizing Connecticut's red flag law, the nation's first of its kind legislation, following the 1998 shooting at the Connecticut Lottery. Thank you, Representative Staffstrom, as well for joining us today. Thank you again for coming to this important conversation. I'm sure our attendees are excited to learn about the important work being done in our states towards addressing gun violence. So let's get into it. Kerri?
I gotta learn to unmute myself. Thank you, Jackie. And again, thank you to our panelists. But of course, we'd also like to thank you and the Rockefeller Institute and the Consortium for all your work in putting this event together. So thanks. I thought we'd just start by allowing our panelists about 5 minutes each to tell us a little bit about their state's gun violence prevention policy priorities. And in their remarks, I'd ask the panelists to tell us what they think their state is doing well and the policies you'd like your state to focus on in the future. I'm going to start with Assemblymember Simon.
Thank you very much, Kerri, and thank you to the Rockefeller Institute for pulling this together, and to my fellow panelists and the moderators. This is a great opportunity to speak to people more broadly about gun violence, which of course is uppermost on so many people's minds these days. It's really quite astounding to me just how frequently we are experiencing gun violence, but also mass gun violence, which is just increasing. And so obviously we're doing something wrong in this country. New York has really been trying to lead the way on sort of a basic vision that when you have too easy access to gun violence it increases. And New York has, on the whole, is a much safer state when it comes to gun violence and gun violence related deaths, because we have strong laws that really limit the availability of firearms to people who might use those firearms in a way that is going to be counter to the public's interest. Because we are also, like so many others, affected very much by the lack of federal policy and strong federal laws that keep those guns coming in. And I know my fellow legislators on this panel have the same experience, which is that the guns that come into our state are coming in from other states that have very, very lax gun laws. And until we have really strong federal protections, we are going to continue to have the iron pipeline fuel so much of the gun violence in our states. New York has tried to lead the way originally with our SAFE Act. There's some things we need to do a little bit more and a little bit better. And to close like the boyfriend loophole, to pass the extreme risk protection orders, to ban bump stocks, to ban ghost guns. And, certainly we have funded research, but also we have funded through the Federal Crime Victims Act. We have dedicated a portion of those funds to the Cure Violence and Violence Interrupter programs throughout our state. And we are also have really led the way in passing a bill that would empower us to, under public nuisance, go after gun manufacturers and have them held liable. The governor declared the first in the nation, New York State was a public health emergency due to gun violence. And our legislation has been upheld by the federal government. Our attorney general sued 10 gun distributors last year, and the city sued 5. And so we are really going at gun violence manufacturer liability. Also, we had merchandise codes that we it created, and that right now that's not being followed very much, but we've done that. And just shortly later today, we will be introducing a bill. I'm a prime sponsor in the Assembly on lockdown drills and limiting those, because we know that they're actually far more traumatizing for students than not. So I'm happy to talk about what I think we need to do better. I think I've probably taken up my 5 minutes, and want to make sure that my colleagues from other states have an opportunity to talk about their states. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember. It's really exciting to hear about sort of the trajectory of New York's laws. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Senator Singleton.
Good morning, everyone. And let me begin by echoing the comments of my colleague, Assemblywoman Simon, and thanking all of those who have a hand in putting this together for this very important discussion. I don't think we talk about this topic enough with the kind of emphasis that it demands, because we are really in the business of trying to save lives here by making sure that our state's laws are effective when it comes to that. The state of New Jersey has been known historically for having strong gun laws. I think within our country, only California, New York, and Hawaii, based on research, have stronger gun laws. So we're always chasing my friend, Assemblywoman Simon, and the work that we do as to our neighbors to the north. But we've recently had some complete overhaul of some of the pieces of legislation that we've done just as of last December. And you think about the things we did and I have done historically, which is, have greater background checks for handgun purposes, forcing people to obtain a permit to carry a gun in public as a reflection of the Bruin decision, what we had to do there, though we're still in litigation on that law right now. Allow law enforcement to seek court orders to prevent certain individuals from assessing guns and requiring secure storage for firearms, and focusing on ghost guns, having passed legislation to do that as well as really trying to get our arms around the illegal guns that are flowing into our state. I think when we talk a lot about the issue of guns, and those who may not see it the same way that many of us do, often say, well, you're trying to besmirch the Second Amendment. And I think the Second Amendment can coexist with good gun laws. All right. Our whole objective is to make sure that we are not seeing guns get in the hands of individuals who shouldn't have them, whether that's from mental health background checks or deeper background checks. It was talked about the boyfriend loophole, and making sure that we go effectively to know what policies, what research tells us that it works. We've tried our best to be scientific in that regard, not just shoot arrows in the dark, but looking what the data tells us. And when you look at the data more broadly and you look at it across the board, states that have high gun ownership without the proper controls around them. And I say controls because, as the Second Amendment tells us, like most rights, that the rights that's secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. So the controls can be put in place. But we know the states that don't have those controls increase gun deaths and increase gun trafficking into states like ours, like Connecticut, like New York, that have pretty strong gun laws. So this discussion, which we could have every day, unfortunately, because every day we read a headline about some other tragic incident that has occurred, tells us that we need to do more. And the state of New Jersey is no different. We continue to endeavor to try and make sure we safeguard our citizens each and every day from the scourge of gun violence. And I'm really thrilled to be here with such an esteemed group to have that conversation. So thank you, Kerri.
Awesome. And thank you for your continued commitment to preventing gun violence. Representative Snapstrom, share your thoughts with us, please.
Thank you, Kerri, and certainly my thanks to you and UConn for all your work on this. Really honored to be here with Assemblymember Simon and Senator Singleton. It's work I'm familiar with. I think it was maybe have a little healthy competition to get towards the top of those lists and stuff when it comes to our laws, and that's probably a good thing. You know, from Connecticut's perspective, it's interesting. I mean, Connecticut really, if you think about it, back even in the beginning in colonial times and through sort of even into through World War I, World War II, Connecticut in many respects has an economy that has been built on the firearm industry, the home of Samuel Holt, and many others. And so Connecticut sort of came to the gun prevention movement, I think, a little later on in the states. And really, as was alluded to earlier, it really was the lottery shooting in the 90s that I think was the first wake-up call for Connecticut and led to us being the first state to pass the first red flag law, which became a model, and we were able to update last year. You know, and then obviously the second big sea change in Connecticut was the horrific Newtown massacre and shooting in 2011, and really was the first time Connecticut undertook a comprehensive review of its gun legislation and really tried to take on a leadership role in this. You know, we've tried to build on that over the last 10 or 12 years, certainly when it comes to safe storage requirements. You know, we've become a leader in that. We have also seen, correspondingly with our tougher gun laws, a precipitous drop in crime. You know, Connecticut and a number of, frankly, blue states have bucked the national trend of crime basically remaining flat over the last 10 or 15 years. And Connecticut has seen a very dramatic drop in crime over its last 10 or 15 years to where we are now, by many measures, the third safest state in the entire nation. Because of our stricter gun laws and because we've employed a number of smart on crime as opposed to tough on crime steps here in Connecticut. You know, but like every state, particularly like our neighboring states, we continue to be a victim of community violence, particularly on the streets of cities like mine in Bridgeport. You know, we saw the nation's 151st mass shooting of the year. It happened in Bridgeport just last week. Didn't get a lot of national press because luckily no one died. But we did have 4 people shot in a single event. And so we continue to look at strengthening our gun laws. This year, the governor has put forward as part of his budget package a very, very robust update to Connecticut's gun laws. It would be the first major update in 10 years and looks at everything from community violence intervention funding to rolling back our open carry laws, to prohibiting bulk purchase of firearms, and closing loopholes in our assault weapons ban, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully we'll get some time to get into that as we go forward. But it really is, I don't want to say an exciting time, but it's an important time, both for our nation and locally here in Connecticut, as we continue to push forward and make sure that we are, as Senator Singleton said, preventing every death that we can prevent through our gun legislation.
Great. Thank you so much, Representative. I've heard all of you make different remarks, but also there seem to be some themes. One of the themes is that this is something that has to evolve, right? All of you talk about like a history of gun laws and gun intervention in your state. You talk about the need for stronger state level gun laws, especially in the absence of federal gun laws, which we certainly will talk about a little bit later. The boyfriend loophole, trafficking of guns, I think is something that affects these 3 states particularly. So I'd love to get into that a little bit later. But first, given this comment on history, I want to talk about something that we've seen almost as a new phenomenon throughout the US, which is how COVID has affected firearms and firearm deaths, right? So, one of the major gun violence observations is that gun violence really spiked during COVID, and all of your states experienced an increase in gun violence during COVID, if I'm not mistaken. Please feel free to correct me if that's wrong. But given that, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this looks different, and if it changed your evolution or trajectory at all as you were thinking about how to build laws in your state and build a system where we could prevent and intervene in gun violence. So yeah, I just also like you to talk about the surge in firearm sales sort of during and post-pandemic. And so Senator Singleton, I'm going to ask you if you would start us off on that conversation.
Great question. Look, I think COVID has had an impact on our quality of life and our way of life all across the board. And unfortunately, gun violence is no exception to it. One of the things that we've looked at to try and combat that is to use other resources that we have in our state at our disposal to try and really effectively curb the scourge of gun violence in the sense of trying to get more community violence prevention services in place. And I'll tip my hat to my friends from Connecticut who've been doing this and using their Medicaid dollars to do that. We here in the state of New Jersey are now endeavoring to do that. And put it simply so that for those who aren't aware, we're in New Jersey, and I'm the author of this legislation that's now making its way through the New Jersey Senate, will require community violence prevention services to be covered by Medicaid. And these services are all evidence-based, trauma-informed treatment programs. When you think of things like peer support and counseling and crisis intervention, aimed at improving the health outcomes and promoting more positive behavioral change. So research tells us that victims of gunshot wounds, nearly 2 out of 3 patients are either on Medicaid or uninsured. So this coverage to me is critical throughout the duration of a survivor's physical and psychological well-being and recovery. And as I said, one of the good things my old boss used to say to me is New Jersey doesn't always have to be the first. Like when you see good legislation somewhere else, you try and wrap your brain around and find to do it. And my friends from Connecticut, and I believe Illinois is another state that's actually effectively done this as well, are leading that charge. And so we're trying to do that. And this bill, it was passed about a month or so ago in the Senate. And it dovetails nicely with the work that Governor Murphy, our governor here in the state, has used, because we use some of our COVID dollars, about $10 million in American Recovery Resource dollars to funding for our state hospital-based violence intervention programs. And then that comes on the heels after we had already spent, the state of New Jersey, $20 million from the Federal Victims of Crime Act to fund 9 hospital-based intervention programs. So we have to be more creative and more innovative in how we're going to use all of our state's resources to target this problem. It's not just one particular vein that's going to help us bend the curve and break the back on gun violence. It's going to be a lot of different levers. And as I said, we start from a position of trying to focus on evidence-based research and tactics that we know work. there's a reservoir of data that tells us that what Connecticut has done has shown positive benefits. What Illinois has done has shown positive benefits. Now we want to do it to scale all throughout. And Kerri, it goes back to your first point. I think all of us as state legislators, while we're all incredibly policy focused, we would all love for there be a national model to address all of these issues. So there's not a patchwork of state work to do it. But because of the sort of toxicity of Washington right now, frankly, it's left to fall to representatives like the three you have here and all across the country to safeguard our citizens state by state. So we got to keep getting creative and keep getting innovative in ways to do that. And this is one that, like I said, my friends from Connecticut have led on that we are trying to endeavor to do here in the state of New Jersey as well.
Well, thank you, and also to all of you for your continued work on this, given the real challenges. Representative Staffstrom, given the Connecticut context of that, I wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in.
Yeah, well, certainly Senator Singleton, I think, covered the Medicaid issue better than I could, so I appreciate that shout out. But I want to pick up on something he just mentioned, which was sort of how the toxicity of Washington sort of trickles down, and how that impacts the work we're trying to do at a state level. And I think on the COVID gun violence spike, that's particularly evident. And, what we saw here in Connecticut, not to get overly political about this, but was that we saw sort of, I think certainly most of us objectively believe this was a COVID pandemic driven spike in gun violence. And once schools got back open and folks got back to work and the like, that things would level back off. And certainly that's what we've seen in Connecticut is we did have a COVID driven spike in not just in gun violence crimes, but really all crime, car theft, catalytic converter theft, I mean, you name it. And we've seen that spike level off, and we've continued sort of the other, but for 21 and 22, we've seen the downward trend that we've experienced since the early 2000s continue in our overall crime rates dropping back down. So I actually thought during COVID, a lot of what I was trying to do was tell people not to overreact to the spike. As chair of the Judiciary Committee, obviously gun violence legislation is not just my only concern, but really we have led on smart criminal justice policy, reducing sentences, making sure we're not holding folks in prison longer than they need to be, et cetera. And also on making sure that our juvenile justice system is not punitive, but is rehabilitative. And we saw some efforts to try to undo some of those efforts because of the COVID spike in gun violence. And so I really was trying to just put up a stop sign and say, let's take a pause. Let's see what's actually going on here. And I think we've seen that. On where we go from here in terms of some of that spike, I think what we learned coming out of the pandemic is really three things we need to do. One is when we passed a ban on ghost guns a couple of years ago, there's a big gaping loophole in the bill Connecticut passed, which says that the only ghost guns you have to register are those that were purchased after the effective date of that legislation, which makes it very hard for prosecutors to prosecute because they have to prove the date the gun was acquired. So we're looking to repeal that loophole this year, because we have seen and heard from our mayors a lot of the gun violence we saw during the pandemic and on our streets was either guns flowing in from out of state, or it's these ghost guns that are being purchased online and assembled here in Connecticut. Also, we're looking at a bulk purchasing ban in Connecticut this year as part of our legislative package. And certainly, as Senator Singleton mentioned, investment programs are critical. And our budget proposal this year has quite a significant amount of dollars devoted to that.
Thank you. And Assemblymember Simon, New York was really profoundly affected by COVID early on in the pandemic. And so I just want to also give you an opportunity to weigh in on this question if you have additional thoughts.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And yeah, we were very affected. And, I represent a district in Brooklyn and downtown Brooklyn. And so Brooklyn was very affected. If there's a picture of a nursing home where people were dying. It's in my district. That picture is my district. But, I think that, like I think it was Senator Singleton, or maybe it was, Representative Safstrom, who said that, people should not overreact. I think that this issue of increase in crime was, especially gun violence, was a real overreaction because, the NRA has one string on its harp. And that is to scare people and to make them think that the answer to their problems is to arm themselves. And so we saw that happening across the country. But we also saw an increase in crime because people were scared, they were anxious, they were traumatized, they were hungry. Because of losing jobs, they were in danger of eviction. They weren't getting the money they needed to take care of their families. And while it spurred a lot of mutual aid, people just getting in and helping their neighbors and their communities, and that was wonderful, that fear and that anxiety is with us still. It has certainly infected the politics in New York State. I've had people email me saying, it's all bail reform. And of course, bail reform in New York had nothing to do with the rise in crime everywhere else in the country. But that has really affected the conversations in New York. And we are currently, sitting around waiting on a budget that to happen because so much of this conversation has been really affected by fear and by the fear mongering. And we know who tends to do that better than others. So I'm really looking forward to sort of getting past this. We are seeing a decrease in crime across the board. Retail theft is an issue. Again, it's an issue across the country. And I think it will take some time before we adjust to a sort of post-COVID environment and are able to address those needs. But those communities that are safer are the ones with more resources, the ones with better mental health care. And one of the things I'm very concerned about, and I appreciate Michael, that you're a psychologist. I actually moved to New York to become a clinical psychologist and realized I would be terrible at it. But but I know enough to be dangerous. But one of the things that I always focus on is the fact that we tend to use that as an excuse for not coming up with policy and not funding the kinds of mental health care that we need and recognition. So when we passed our red flag law, one of the things our governor said at the time, he would talk about mental health issues. And that's not what this is about. It's about people who have demonstrated that they want, in fact, to harm others or themselves. So we have to be careful that we are not inadvertently stigmatizing mental illness further, and that we actually provide, constructive solutions to those issues so that doesn't become a problem.
Fantastic. And that is a great segue to the next topic that I wanted to talk about. But before I do that, let me vouch for Mike. He's a great psychologist. So he's fantastic. So, we've talked about lack of change at the federal level, but in 2022, we saw the first federal legislation in a long time. The landmark legislation is the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And in fact, a similar, Simon, to some of your points, this law has several provisions, one of which is ERPO and some strengthening of mental health services. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what this legislation means for your state, how you're thinking about using this legislation to advance your state's priorities, et cetera. And so I'd like to start with Representative Safstrom for that question.
Well, thanks for highlighting that. And obviously, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to our home state senator in Washington, Senator Chris Murphy, for his leadership on this, and really all of his leadership in DC. We're very, very proud of the work he has done in trying to roll the ball up the hill, even though sometimes it seems it keeps rolling back down on him in DC. But I think you highlighted sort of I think the major provisions of it, which are certainly the investments in mental health services, the investments in community violence dollars, and also the push for ERPO legislation around the country. And I do think we're starting to see that. Connecticut, as I said, we passed the first law, but really our law had not been updated until 2021. And kind of simultaneous with the push for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, we were undertaking a review and update of that and looking at best practices from other states, including New York, New Jersey, and others, and even some states that usually we don't look to for updates to our gun laws. I mean, I actually looked at the law in Indiana when we went to update ours, which was passed by this very liberal governor in Indiana named Mike Pence. So sometimes good ideas do come from strange places, but I'm heartened that after, I think what we passed in Connecticut, because it was most recent, is again the nation leading red flag bill, that law is being used and looked at by states like Tennessee now as models for efforts elsewhere. I mean, we've seen, and actually we're looking at another update to our red flag law this year because we're actually seeing an overwhelming applications, which I consider a good thing. And so we're looking at ways to sort of streamline the process for our court system and for our police departments. In the 20 years of Connecticut's original version of the ERPO, we had about 2,500 applications. Since we passed the update in 2021, we're approaching another 2,500 applications. So it shows you just the sheer volume that are coming in by having that policy. And I also think not just the law being on the book, but the public awareness of that opportunity. And we're seeing it from neighbors, family members, and local police departments that are realizing how powerful a tool it can be to prevent particularly suicide death, as well as potential mass shooting.
Fantastic, thank you. Would either of our other panelists like to weigh in on how the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, sorry, I always get that a little bit wrong, is being implemented in your state? I mean, I know this bill, for example, provides $750 million of funding for states to either start an ERPO or to change how they're implementing an ERPO. And Representative Staffstrom talked about the increase in applications that we're seeing here in Connecticut. And I'm just wondering if, you know, other states are seeing that same thing, or if there's something about your ERPO system that you think could benefit from additional implementation dollars, et cetera. So I see Assemblymember Simon has unmuted, and so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think we're seeing a similar trend here. You know, one of the things that I was on my own, having passed ERPO previously, and we had a pretty strong one. It was the first one that included school personnel being able to file for an extreme risk protection order, trying to get that data out of our system, our Supreme Court system. So it's a civil action, as you know, and it was taking me forever to get any data. And finally, I got it by county, and Suffolk County, which is, you know, I had, when I passed it the first time, which I had to do it a couple of times before we got it through both houses, I had a lot of support from Republicans in my house for that bill. And in fact, Suffolk County, which is largely GOP led, has been the largest county because they have a lot of retired firefighters and a lot of retired cops. And so they're very aware of that, and they've been actually using it much more effectively than other counties. But one of the things that happened, we had a mass shooting in Buffalo, and that was the first big, terrible mass shooting that New York State had. And Uvalde followed that. And so we passed a series of bills just before the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, making sure you could not buy certain weapons until you were 21, et cetera, et cetera. But also the governor then mandated that law enforcement, would have to, in fact, file if somebody came to them with a concerns that that person might actually meet the standards that would lead a court to be able to file an extreme, grant an extreme risk protection order. But of course, the prosecutor's offices don't know what to do with a civil action. So she gave money to the state police, but that's a smaller force. So what we did was we expanded the funding for that from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and other resources. And now this year, one of the things we're doing in our budget, although I'm not authorized to announce it, but certainly something I have been pushing for with some colleagues, is that a lot of small law enforcement in small towns and counties don't have lawyers on deck, and the Attorney General's office can't do it. But they did help us come up with an amount of money, and we're looking for $14 million to fund lawyers to represent those counties and those small law enforcement agencies to bring extreme risk protection orders in civil court. Because we find that if you leave it to prosecutors, number one, they're not familiar with those procedures, but also they just mentally use a different standard, the standard of imminent harm, when the standard is really whether you're a danger to yourself or others. And so I'm very hopeful that this budget will have that funding so that we can ensure that law enforcement is in fact responding to that. Because right now, what I know is some counties is just not filing those orders. And so that's a real problem. So we're looking at that. And then the other things that I think we really need is better education and training on that. Because so many people don't realize that they are in fact empowered. We have a pretty good system. We have a pretty clear system of ways that people could file that pro se in our Supreme Court. I think and I would like better research on this, I think that people have hesitated to do that because they're frightened. And I think it is easier for people to go to law enforcement and say, could you do this for me? Because I'm scared of my kid, or I'm scared of my husband, I'm scared of my boyfriend. Can you do this? I don't want to be outed on this. And I think, we need to really work with law enforcement to understand what this is and what it isn't, and empower them to do that and really help protect the public that way.
Great. And Senator Singleton, please weigh in on how New Jersey is responding.
Well, Kerri, what I would say, and maybe more broadly, my colleagues have covered a lot as it relates to this topic and all appropriate stuff, is this legislation in itself is an embodiment when we put facts over fear, right? And for the last decade or so, if you think about our process, we've started to see the electorate move towards saying, hey, I want to see more gun safety enacted. And then once the electorate moves to that, then the politics sort of lines up with it, because they start to see people who used to be representatives who were in roadblocks are no longer representatives, and people who are more inclined to want to do it are in their seats. And then once you get that dynamic in place, the electorate and the right people in the right chairs, then public policy like this act, this federal act, which is monumental, come in place and happen. And that's a blueprint for how it's supposed to work, right? That's how we were all taught about the civics aspect of it. That's how it's supposed to work. And this is an embodiment of that. And I know it was a comment and a call out for Senator Murphy, who's done so much on this for years and years and years. And you just think of how now this was able to galvanize a nation, right? When you start thinking of all the players who were associated with that bill across the board, and you see it, whether it's, Senator Cronin out of Texas, Senator Tillis, I think, out of North Carolina, and others, like you start to see now folks are saying, hey, this also was good politics, when many of us knew it was just good policy all along. So beyond all the measures that are part of this bill, the money for mental health services, expanded pieces there to, again, as Joanne said, not to stigmatize anyone that's challenged, but to recognize when folks need help, they have help available. And that's what those resources are going to do. And the additional money in community intervention, violence intervention programs, they're going to be game changers. And the evidence tells us that they will be.
So I'm a professor of public policy, and I will agree with you that the electorate obviously has a lot to do here, but there's another co-equal branch of government that we talk about, which is the Supreme Court, which is an appointed body. And we've recently seen federal judicial decisions also affecting how states are able to respond to gun violence. And, the high profile example that we've seen most recently is the Supreme Court's 2022, almost at the exact same time as the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, was the Bruen decision. And of course, Bruen was challenging New York Sullivan law, which is a permitless carry law, and has recast how we think about permit laws in general, and may have many other impacts on other gun laws. So I'd like to just know how each of your states is responding to this piece of federal action, not legislation, but action. And given that this started really around the New York law, I'd like to ask Assemblymember Simon to start off this part of the conversation.
Well, thank you. We were, of course, very disappointed in the Supreme Court's decision. New York's law had been in existence for 110 years and was working just fine. And it wasn't harming anybody's ability to carry concealed if, in fact, they met very basic standards. One of the things I did before the decision even came out, because I was, sort of very involved in what we were doing on our end, was to draft a bill about sensitive spaces where we would not allow guns. And what we ended up doing was taking that piece and expanding it and passing a very extensive laws post-Bruen on July 1st. So it was right after the decision that we came up with a response. And we really are limiting sensitive locations. We really identify those sensitive locations to be the kinds of places where really nobody wants to go to a football game in Buffalo and not have their child come home, right? And it's based on that very basic reality. And that is, there are places where people should not be carrying guns and they should not be carrying concealed. And we also then had stiffer penalties for places that where we're calling them, it's a restricted location. So we have two sections. One is the sensitive locations and the other is the restricted locations, like the subway and things like that, where that really, big places where you're in small environments and people, we have stiffer criminal penalties for that. That, of course, has been challenged, immediately was challenged in a court that was going to be a good venue for the challengers. And the result was one saying, well, this is terrible, it's unconstitutional, it's et cetera, et cetera. And that's on appeal currently. And I think we have a little more faith in the appellate courts. So we're going to be waiting and seeing how that goes. In the meantime, we are going forward as a state, assuming that, in fact, it will be upheld. And that's the way we have addressed this issue. But obviously, the levels of gun violence around the country are really the kinds of things that are reinforcing what it is New York's always said, right? And we just yesterday, a couple of days ago, had some poor, young woman could take a wrong turn in a driveway, was backing out, and some guy just came out and shot, and she's dead. Right. So it's outrageous. So we don't have a stand your ground law here in New York, but they're acting as if they do in some places. So we really need to start, I think, collaborating more with other states, talking about what's working, why it's working, and to, continue to do that research that will give us that evidence basis for the policies that we know are going to be working.
Thank you. Senator Singleton, how has Bruen affected New Jersey?
Well, we got to start from the basic premise that the Bruen decision fundamentally alters the well-established test for evaluating gun laws that were in place after the Heller decision. So what it does now is it says that essentially that the laws are regulating that if it does, that the government, this is a quote, the government must affirmatively prove that its firearm regulation is part of the historical tradition to set boundaries on gun laws. And I can tell you, if our laws were based on historical conditions, I wouldn't be sitting in front of you for this conversation. And perhaps Joanne wouldn't be allowed to be at the front of the microphone as well. So it'd be a smaller group of us sitting here. So I think when we see that rationale, we know what the underpinnings are all about. But even at that, the justices said that it is settled, exact quote, settled, that there are sensitive places where carrying guns can be prohibited consistent with the Second Amendment. So that's where the New Jersey most recent law that has been challenged is looking to do. Things like polling places, as an example, places like congregations and protests and public transportation, all deemed sensitive places under our most recently passed law that, again, is subject to subject to litigation at the current point. But additionally, what Bruen allowed us to do, what we believe we can do, is to focus on the idea of mandating both liability insurance and training for permit holders, which is something in our law that was passed. And under Bruen, the court examined mid-19th century laws known as surety statutes, which required gun owners at that time to post a bond under certain circumstances that they would be forfeited if the owner breached the peace. So using, again, this historical tradition mindset, it is not a far leap for any legislature to say that they would mandate liability insurance for gun owners. So keeping minimum levels of insurance is, to me, is an obvious modern connection to historical tradition, one that is consistent with New Jersey's most recent law. And it gives us, I think, ample room to combat the misuse of firearms. So things like the training aspect of things and requiring that training, I think, are all consistent with what Bruin still tells us. Ultimately, it'll be decided in a court of law as to whether or not our interpretation of the Bruin decision is accurate. But we start from a fundamental point that we have an obligation, both morally as well as our oath that we've all taken as legislators, to protect the safety and well-being of the citizens of our respective states. This endeavor was part of our goal of trying to do that, and recognizing that the Bruin decision, once again, has fundamentally altered how we view gun regulation in our state. I think, to the detriment of public safety. So we're trying to combat that on our state's level.
So I think that's like truly fascinating. I really hadn't thought about that historical connection before, right? The way I've seen the courts interpreting the historical connection, right? The most sort of public one is the Rahimi case from Texas that says that abusers can't be denied firearms, domestic abusers, due to the lack of a historical precedent there. So I think that's another interesting way to think about that. Representative Shafstrom, I am gonna turn it over to you to talk about how Bruin, how Connecticut's thinking about Bruin, or responding or planning to respond.
Well, I think historical tradition means the only gun that should be allowed in the state of Connecticut is a single-shot musket, right? If we're really going to take it to the full degree. But anyway, we'll see whether I can get Jen up to support for that. But no, I mean, in all seriousness, obviously the Bruin decision just emphasizes it was a fine point. I mean, the Supreme Court of the United States priorities are in the absolute wrong place. It is amazing. They continue to try to make it harder to keep citizens safe. I think what we're looking at in Connecticut is in a little bit on the sensitive location stuff, probably not as much as my colleagues have highlighted on, but really where we're looking at is certainly the type of firearms that are available, right? We're looking at really strengthening and tightening up our assault weapons ban, because even though we have a ban, we know the gun manufacturers continue to try to find ways to get around the language of the statute. So we're looking to close a bunch of those loopholes. We're looking at state level licensing of gun dealers, because the sort of the federal licensing, federal enforcement on gun dealers is just not as robust as it should be. And so we believe we should have a state role in that, and are looking at state level licensing. We do have a ban on large capacity magazines, but frankly, the penalty for possessing one is far too low. So we are looking at increasing that penalty. And, you know, we really have worked on our safe storage requirements, not just in the home. We currently have leaving the governor has proposed support this effort to make some secure home whenever they're not in home, because we see one of the main ways that illegal guns end up on our streets is they're stolen from a home and then used when someone's not there. But also another bill we passed recently was a safe storage in the car ban as well, that said if you have a firearm in the car and you are not within immediate ability to access that firearm, it has to be locked up either in a gun case or in the glove box. Again, trying to stop prevent the theft of that. But no question, Bruin is making our lives more difficult. And the bill that just came out of the Judiciary Committee a couple weeks ago here in Connecticut, certainly I spent a good amount of the debate on that bill fighting with my Republican colleagues about whether that bill passes muster under Bruin or not. And certainly I believe it does. They believe it doesn't. And the court may end up deciding who's right on that, but that was in large measure what the debate focused on.
Thank you. I have 2 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mike. So I'm going to send out a question quickly, and you get 20 seconds to respond, and maybe we'll make it to the next one. We'll see. This question we haven't touched on, which is, and this was provided by our audience prior to the panel, how can your state legislator take further action to address police violence, particularly in the context of ending qualified immunity? Senator Singleton, I'm going to send that to you first.
We have legislation pending here in the state of New Jersey to address those topics. And I think part of it is in making sure we have all stakeholders around for that discussion. Qualified immunity and its ramifications have broader implications than just in public safety. And I think not everyone understands that. So it's important to have everyone around the table to be able to address that. But that's the best way to be able to do it. In this legislation, we have endeavors to try and do that. So we'll see where it takes us.
Assemblymember Simon.
Yeah, thank you. We also have pending legislation. It's not my bill, but I'm a sponsor of it. And I think that conversation around what qualified immunity is and what how it's been used and abused is critically important. And I want to say the senator's, comments are quite correct. It's not just in the context of public safety. So, to the extent that people are seeing it as sort of anti-cop or whatever, actually qualified immunity is a problem for us in a variety of ways. As a civil rights lawyer, it's something that I learned early on. So we really need to look at qualified immunity and how to stem the tide of its misuse in a lot of contexts.
And Representative Stastrom, you're promised 20 seconds.
Yep. So Connecticut actually did pass legislation in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We passed fairly nation-leading police accountability legislation shortly thereafter. That legislation did roll back qualified immunity protections in Connecticut. It shortened the statute of limitations. It doesn't protect against intentional conduct by officers, and it eliminates the right of an interlocutory appeal. So I think for the time being, we're probably going to stay where we are in Connecticut.
Yes, thank you. Okay, my time is done on this panel. It's been a pleasure talking to each of you, and thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise so openly. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Anestis for some concluding remarks. Mike?
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this and everybody who tuned in. We covered a lot of ground today, and I'm really grateful to have been able to sort of be here and hear it. And I took some notes throughout, and I'm going to refer to those over the next couple of minutes. But before I even do that, I think I'd be remiss not to point out another area where all three of these states have been really successful. As a suicide researcher, I think about firearm suicide a lot. And all three states here have fairly low suicide rates, in large part because we've been able to avoid a trend that you see elsewhere in the United States, where in 2021, 55% of all suicide deaths were by firearms. In New Jersey, where I live now, it's about 1 in 4. That makes a meaningful difference because it pulls the whole suicide rate down. And so we've talked a lot about a lot of really admirable work that folks like you guys have done. It goes beyond what we've said here today, and I think it's worth pausing to acknowledge that that's a big deal. But as I was watching this conversation take place, I noticed a lot of sort of common themes about things that our states have to deal with together, both in terms of managing the things that happen within our states, but also the things that are coming from outside our states. And it just made me think about all the questions that we have to think about in a given day. And there's a lot of them. Who should have access to firearms? Under what circumstances? What processes should be in place to regulate the acquisition of firearms? And who should we be focusing on in making those regulations or restrictions? Who can carry? Where can they carry? Under what circumstances can they discharge their firearms? Obviously, we've seen several heartbreaking stories in the news just the past couple of days that speak to the importance of understanding how we can manage that kind of situation. How should firearms be stored in and around the home? And how can we best motivate the use of secure firearm storage practices, not just in moments of extreme distress, but overall? What resources can we provide to facilitate legal and safe outside of home storage? And how can we navigate liability for the retailers willing to assist with that public service to keep people safe without having to put their businesses at risk to do that? How do we deal with the trafficking of firearms into our states from other states with less oversight about firearm acquisition? There's only so much we can do within our own state when a neighbor approaches it fundamentally differently, and how can we address the increased risk that comes from that? There are so many questions that we need to address, and as of now, we're making really meaningful progress on a lot of these. We saw that through this conversation today. It's a real positive step in the right direction, even in the absence of federal action. In a nation with more firearms than people, reducing firearm injuries and deaths to zero, it's probably not ever going to be a realistic goal, but we can save thousands of lives and prevent countless injuries and tragedies if we take data-driven decisions and all the proper stakeholders are in place having those conversations regularly. I think that's what I value so much about today, is folks who approach this from so many different perspectives come together and talk about it and make these sort of public health decisions based around what we know from the science of gun violence prevention. And so I just want to end this by thanking not just the folks who tuned in, but really the folks who came and logged in and were a part of this conversation. I think that this kind of healthy, non-judgmental, open-minded, data-driven conversation is a really wonderful path towards saving lives and preventing so many of the tragedies that unfortunately make our nation stand out in a unique and kind of horrifying way regularly. And I'll tell you, I've had numerous calls that I've ignored from the UK during this call that I know are from the Times London radio to talk about gun violence in America. What you guys are doing helps that call be less necessary. So thank you very much for what you do.
Yes, and thank you again so much to our panelists and my esteemed co-hosts as well for helping us put this event together. And we'd like to take a moment to thank all of you who joined us today. We will have the playback available soon, as well as a policy blog summarizing many of the amazing key points that were raised here today. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us and wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you. That went great. That was great.
Agreed. That was really good. I thought they